Our next chapter is going to be looking at the institution of education. We'll be taking a close look at examining how different racial groups experience disparity of resources in accessing an American education. We'll be turning our focus now to race and education. We'll consider not only disparity of resources between different geographic areas, which can then set up an issue of systemic discrimination, but also the history that took us to this point in time. To understand the discrimination that students are experiencing today, we have to understand the discriminatory policies of the past. A central question that will be discussed in this chapter is, how does membership in a specific racial group impact the American educational experience? We should be looking not only at disparity of resources to understand this, but also to punishment, discipline, and suspension, and any expulsion data of minority youth. The U.S. has a history of educational segregation. Most of you will probably recall the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case from the 1950s, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate could not be equal, and that the schools desegregate across the country. Well before that, Chinese parents sued the school district in Chinatown, San Francisco, to allow their children to go to the public school. This isn't a U.S. Supreme Court case, but rather was one in the California Court of Appeals. In Tate versus Hurley, an 1885 case, the school district built a separate school for children of parents from China, Korea, or Japan. Mamie Tate, who was 8 years old at that time, was denied access to the school. The appellate courts found that Mamie could not be denied entry into the regular public school. 10 years after that, the U.S. Supreme Court heard the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which considered if a black person could be denied entrance into the whites-only car on a train. Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black and could pass as white, was arrested. The U.S. Supreme Court heard the case and ruled that separate could be deemed to be equal. This case then supported for many years the doctrine of separate but equal, and was the rationale for supporting segregated schools. In 1927, a father sued the school board because his Chinese-American daughter was denied admission to an all-white school. The Supreme Court decided, based on Plessy versus Ferguson, that the school board could maintain separate schools for non-white children. But in 1925, in Romo versus Laird, a Mexican-American father sued the Tempe, Arizona school board for his children who were being forced to go to a non-white school. Because many of the teachers in the non-white school were not certified teachers, in fact, many of them were student teachers, the court found that the schools were not equal, and the children were allowed to go to what was then an all-white school. In 1930, a California court found that children could not be forced to go to a non-white school on the rationale that children might need remedial English language classes. Then, in 1946, a California court found that the doctrine in Plessy versus Ferguson was not valid. The California court determined that separate was not equal. However, it was a California court making this decision, and it didn't have the weight and authority to overturn the federal Plessy versus Ferguson case, meaning that the California decision was not binding on other states. State by state, the laws varied regarding how they provided for either segregated or non-segregated schools. Some states mandated segregation. Those schools in the southern regions of the U.S. held firmly to this belief. Northern states were more likely to have laws that actually forbid segregation, and some states either were silent to the issue or allowed it to be optional or limited. It's interesting to consider the geographical and regional differences towards this issue. The Brown case was filed on behalf of 20 children that lived in Topeka, Kansas. It was filed by the NAACP, and research from the Clark-Dahl study was used as evidence of the harms of separate but equal doctrine. Brown, of course, struck down the notion of segregated schools, but it took sending in federal marshals and law enforcement to assure that some schools would desegregate. Although Brown versus Board of Education legally overturned segregation, many white communities resisted integration in practice. Even today, de facto, which means in practice, segregation persists. Why is segregation so problematic? It's because segregation translates into educational inequality. Schools with high non-white populations often do not perform as well as predominantly white schools. They also receive less funding, and their students generally do not have the same access to college preparatory courses and advising. The long-term effects of these practices is institutional discrimination, which is significant as education provides the foundation for career achievement and lifelong opportunities.